The worst part was not that he stepped back. The worst part was that he asked me to stay exactly where he left me. I used to think heartbreak announced itself with noise. I thought it arrived in raised voices, in doors shut too hard, in a glass left cracking in the sink because somebody's hand had trembled with anger. I thought if love was ending, there would at least be something clean in the wreckage. Some scene large enough to match the pain. Some event you could point to later and say, there, that was the moment it broke. But the cruelest endings I have known did not sound like endings at all. They sounded careful. They sounded civilized. They sounded like a man sitting across from me at my kitchen table. His hands loosely folded around a mug of coffee, he was no longer drinking, telling me that he cared about me deeply. That this was not necessarily the end, that he was overwhelmed, that he was confused, that he needed time and space to figure out what he wanted. He said he would let me know. It was such a gentle arrangement if you listened only to the words. So reasonable, so adult, no accusations, no betrayal I could hold in my hand, no visible violence. Just a request for pause, offered in a voice calm enough to make my own pain feel like something impolite. I remember the early light on the counter that morning. I remember the bowl of pears I had forgot to move, one of them already softening at the stem. I remember the radiator making its small, practical noises as if the room were carrying on with its ordinary duties. I remember how his coat was folded over the back of the chair instead of hanging by the door, as if even then he had not fully decided whether he was leaving for an hour or for a season. And I remember the strange instinct I had to protect him from my reaction. That was the first indignity. Not that he wanted distance, not even that he did not know whether he wanted me. It was that I met his uncertainty with care almost immediately. Some part of me, older than reason, stepped forward to make his confusion easier to bear. I lowered my voice. I held my face still. I nodded as if we were discussing an unfortunate but manageable delay. I listened for nuance, for softness, for any trace of the tenderness that had built our life together in private increments. I told myself that composure was dignity. I told myself that love required room. I told myself that if I stayed calm enough, wise enough, undemanding enough, then whatever this was might pass through us instead of ending us. There are women who hear the first fracture and understand it as a warning. I heard it and called it patience. After he left, I cleared the cups from the table and rinsed them immediately, as if domestic order might stop the day from becoming real. I wiped the counter twice. I folded the throw blanket on the sofa and opened the window for 10 minutes because the apartment felt warm in an unnatural way, as if emotion itself had raised the temperature. Then I closed it because the cold outside was sharper than I had expected, and I stood for a long time with my hand still resting on the latch. What does a woman do with a sentence like "I'll let you know"? At first, she behaves as though it means nothing final. At first, she returns to her tasks. I answered emails. I confirmed a staging schedule for a townhouse in Chambery that needed fresh linen, neutral ceramics, and a better arrangement of light in the main bedroom. I made a list for the florist. I watered the fern in the bathroom. I changed the hand soap in the kitchen because the bottle was nearly empty, and I remember noticing, with a kind of unbearable clarity, that I had bought the scent he liked without realizing I had begun making those choices automatically. The whole day developed around a single invisible center, my phone. I did not admit that right away. I told myself I was only keeping it nearby in case he reached out with something practical, but every shift of light across the screen summoned a pulse through my body. Every vibration from a work email arrived with a fraction of hope before disappointment corrected it. I left the sound on. I kept it face up. I took it with me from room to room as if it were fragile or ill. By evening, the apartment had taken on a different shape. It was still mine, and yet not entirely. The objects had not moved, but their meaning had. The chair where he used to leave his jacket became a witness. The side of the bed where he slept last turned into evidence. The shelf where a book he had recommended leaned between two novels I had not yet opened became a kind of suspended bridge between who we had been and what I could not yet name. That night I slept in sections. Not because I wept. I did not at first. Grief had not gathered enough force yet to become water. It was still living in the body as vigilance. I woke to silence and listened to it as if it contained a message. I turned over and studied the dark outline of the wardrobe. I thought about calling him, then decided that was exactly what a wise woman would not do. I thought about sending something measured and kind, then decided words would only complicate what time might settle. I told myself that love was not proven in the easy hours. I told myself that this was a test of steadiness. I told myself that if I could remain a calm harbor, he would remember what peace felt like and come back toward it. In the morning, I looked almost normal. That was another cruelty of uncertain heartbreak. From the outside, it can resemble self-control. I dressed for work, pinned my hair, chose the camel coat that made me feel assembled, and carried myself through the city with the same contained competence that had built most of my adult life. I was 41 years old. I had already survived one marriage that had ended not in scandal, but in erosion, the kind of slow diminishment that taught you how quietly a life can become unlivable. I had learned to support myself, to make rooms beautiful, to create invitation where there had been vacancy. My work was its own kind of intimate theater. I entered houses people were preparing to leave and gave them one last version of warmth. I softened harsh corners. I placed flowers where no one would keep them alive for long. I laid folded towels in bathrooms no family would ever use together. I knew how to create the appearance of a life ready to receive love. I had become very skilled at beauty in temporary spaces. At the townhouse that morning, sunlight poured through high windows and pooled on the kitchen island in a way that made the stone look gentler than it was. I unpacked pears into a ceramic bowl, adjusted the angle of two stools, and stepped back to study the room. The house needed suggestion more than truth. It needed the feeling that breakfast conversations could happen there, that a woman might stand at that sink and not feel lonely, that a man might come home eager for the evening. My work required a faith in possibility that was almost architectural. And there, in a home being dressed for strangers, I felt the first true split. I was standing in a staged kitchen arranging branches in a stone vase, and it struck me with almost physical force that I was spending my days manufacturing certainty for other people, while my own life had become a waiting room. I had placed a linen napkin beside a plate and thought, with a sudden inward flinch, this is what I have done with myself. I have set a place at a table where no one has promised to arrive. Still, hope is not embarrassed easily. It builds its private rooms. In the first week after he asked for the break, I survived almost entirely on remembered tenderness. I replayed him the way people replay songs they cannot stop hearing. Not the whole man, of course. Not his evasions, not the subtle fatigue I had sometimes sensed in him when the subject of future became concrete, not the way his uncertainty always seemed to acquire eloquence the moment I needed clarity. Memory is a selective architect. It keeps the soft lighting and removes the drafts. So I remembered his hand at the small of my back in crowded restaurants, the instinctive protectiveness of it. I remembered the October weekend in Lisbon when rain had trapped us in a hotel room for half a day, and we had read in silence on the bed, our bodies touching only at the ankle, which somehow felt more intimate than desire. I remembered him bringing me coffee on a Sunday morning exactly the way I liked it without asking. I remembered the look on his face once when I told him about a project that mattered to me, how attentively he listened, as if my mind were a place he genuinely wanted to live. I remembered him saying, in one of those late-night pockets of honesty that can make a woman rearrange her future, that being with me felt peaceful. Peaceful. It was such a dangerous word for someone like me. I had spent enough of my life mistaking emotional weather for passion that peace felt almost sacred when it arrived. And because it felt sacred, I was willing to forgive the ways it disappeared. I told myself depth did not always translate cleanly into certainty. I told myself complex men needed room to come forward. I told myself intimacy could exist before form. We had been happy, I insisted to myself. Not perfectly, not simply, but in a real way. Surely something real would not dissolve because a man was tired, or frightened, or temporarily lost inside himself. Surely he would remember. The mind of a waiting woman becomes devotional. It reads signs into absences. It turns scraps into scripture. If he watched my story but did not reply, perhaps that meant he was keeping a thread. If he had not returned a book, perhaps he expected to see me again. If his silence stretched 3 days instead of 5, perhaps he was thinking carefully. If he said he missed me but could not talk yet, perhaps that was progress. The humiliating genius of uncertainty is that it can keep hope alive on almost nothing. A single ambiguous phrase can feed it for weeks. All the while, I curated myself around a possible return. I did not send angry messages. I did not ask for an answer he had already deferred. I did not become inconveniently wounded. Even in private, I was editing the shape of my pain into something he might one day find easy to re-enter. I wanted, though I would not have admitted it then, to be the kind of woman a man could come back to without discomfort. Spacious, mature, unchaotic, still loving, but not requiring an account of herself. It shames me a little now, how elegantly I tried to disappear. I changed nothing visible in the apartment because changing things would have made the break feel less temporary. His toothbrush remained in the glass by the sink for longer than I will ever find noble. The sweater he had left draped over my chair stayed there as if fabric could hold a future in place. I did not delete old messages. I reread them instead, studying tone the way other women study weather maps, looking for patterns, for evidence, for reassurance hidden in old warmth. Sometimes I would pause over a sentence he had sent months earlier and feel a brief, almost ecstatic relief. See, I would think. See how real this was. See how tender he could be. As though the existence of tenderness in the past guaranteed integrity in the present. As though a man's former sincerity could make his current uncertainty less costly. At work, I began making mistakes so small no one else would have called them mistakes, but I recognized them because precision had always been one of the ways I kept myself safe. I forgot to order candles for a dining table. I misjudged proportions and had to redo a console arrangement twice. I stood in doorways longer than necessary, not from indecision but from drift, as if some part of me was slightly behind the rest. My body knew before my mind consented to know. Food lost dimension. Sleep became thin and technical. My chest had a habit of tightening in late afternoon, as if dreading evening before it arrived. I moved through the city with the distinct sensation that ordinary life was happening through glass. Cafes remained full, buses came and went, women in bright scarves laughed into their phones, men carried groceries home as if being expected somewhere were the most natural thing in the world. I watched them all with the strange loneliness of someone whose private suffering had no visible event attached to it. If he had left me for another woman outright, perhaps my grief would have had edges. If he had betrayed me in a way language recognized, perhaps I could have hated him cleanly. But what do you do with a man who says he cares, who says he is trying to be honest, who simply cannot decide? You suffer quietly, because ambiguity always flatters itself as complexity. One afternoon, perhaps 2 weeks into the break, I stood in an unfurnished bedroom of a client's apartment and straightened a duvet that no one would sleep beneath before the place sold. The room was all pale wood and pale walls and a wide window, overlooking a street lined with plane trees just beginning to surrender their leaves. I smoothed the bed with both palms and was overtaken by a thought so plain it nearly undid me. I have become someone awaiting permission to continue. Not permission in the practical sense. I still worked. I paid my bills. I answered emails. I crossed streets and bought groceries and remembered to take the dry cleaning. But underneath all of it, my life had been suspended around a future decision that was not mine. I was not choosing dinner based on hunger. I was choosing it based on whether a message might come. I was not planning weekends based on desire. I was leaving them open. I was not inhabiting my days. I was buffering them. That is how self-abandonment often begins. Not dramatically. In tiny, courteous postponements. The midpoint of my unraveling did not arrive with proof of infidelity or some scene designed for clarity. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, in a part of the city I had no reason to avoid and had never thought of as hostile. I had finished a consultation early and stopped for coffee at a place near Plaza de Olivide, where the windows always fogged in winter, and the tables were small enough to make solitude feel intentional rather than sad. I was standing just outside, waiting for my takeaway, when I looked through the glass and saw him. Jack. He was seated at a corner table with a woman I did not know. There are moments when the body comprehends before thought catches up, and this was one of them. The recognition moved through me like a drop in temperature. Not dramatic, just absolute. He was laughing. Not wildly, not intimately even, but with ease. With the kind of unguarded ease I had not seen in him for weeks before the break, perhaps longer. His shoulders were loose. His face was lit with ordinary presence. He looked not like a man carrying the weight of difficult truth, not like someone in the solemn interior labor of deciding whether to return to a woman who loved him. He looked like a person living, a person moving lightly through an afternoon, a person not suspended at all. I never learned who she was. For a long time, I thought that should matter more than it did. Whether she was a colleague, a friend, someone new, someone not new, someone romantic, someone merely convenient. But the devastation was not in the deepest sense about her. It was about what I saw on his face: relief, option, unburdened motion. The break, I realized in that instant, was not happening equally to both of us. I had been living as though we were sharing a difficult pause. In truth, I was carrying its full emotional cost, while he moved through the world with access to possibility. He had stepped back from certainty. I had stepped out of my own life. The coffee in my hand felt absurdly hot. I walked away before he could see me, not because I wanted to preserve his comfort, though perhaps some old reflex still did, but because I suddenly understood that any accidental meeting would require me to perform a composure I no longer had. I turned onto a side street and stood beneath a pharmacy sign, pulsing its green cross into the daylight. And for the first time since he had asked for the break, something inside me stopped calling his uncertainty noble. Humiliation is a clarifying force. It strips romance from waiting. I wish I could say that was the moment I became free. It was not. Freedom would have been cleaner than what came next. What came next was bargaining, because even after dignity has been wounded, hope resists dying. I told myself I might have misunderstood. I told myself coffee proved nothing. I told myself that ease on his face did not erase what had once been true between us. I told myself, with a shame so sharp I could barely name it, that perhaps he needed to move freely through the world in order to come back sure of me. That was when I began to understand something terrible. It was not only certainty I wanted. I wanted to be chosen after uncertainty. I wanted the pain to mean something. I wanted every silenced impulse, every dignified pause, every night spent not reaching for him to become retroactively noble, because in the end he would say, "I know now. I know it's you. I know what I almost lost." I did not just want love, I wanted redemption for waiting. Once I saw that, I could no longer fully respect my own hope. And yet I still could not quite set it down. I moved through the days with two selves at war inside me, the one who knew I was being diminished, and the one still kneeling before the possibility that my endurance would be rewarded. He finally wrote 19 days after asking for the break. 19 days is long enough for fantasy to build architecture, and short enough for it still to feel like a season of weather rather than a decision. His message arrived at 21:14 while I was standing at the kitchen counter slicing a pear. I know the time because pain always records its own details with cruel devotion. My phone lit, his name appeared. My body went cold first, then hot. I set the knife down. The message was careful, of course it was. He said he had been thinking of me. He said he missed me. He said I mattered to him, and that the last thing he wanted was to hurt me. He said he was still struggling to understand what he wanted. He said he did not want to lose what we had. He said he just could not promise anything yet. It was a masterpiece of emotional preservation. All tenderness, no responsibility. He wanted to keep the bond alive without taking the form that would make the bond answerable to my life. He wanted access to me as a possibility while remaining unavailable as a decision. He wanted, though I am not sure he would ever have phrased it this way even to himself, the moral innocence of confusion and the emotional benefits of being loved. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the message again. Then again. Then I put the phone face down and stared at the grain of the wood as if it might arrange itself into wisdom. Something in me had reached a depth of exhaustion beyond tears. It was not that I no longer loved him. That would have been too simple. It was that I could suddenly feel the full shape of what loving him in this form required of me. To remain inside this arrangement, even gently, even hopefully, even under the beautiful language of care, would mean consenting to a life organized around someone else's indecision. It would mean making room for future tenderness while forfeiting present peace. It would mean becoming emotionally available to a horizon he refused to claim. I wrote a reply immediately, then deleted it. Then wrote another, kinder one, full of empathy and patience and carefully arranged self-respect. Deleted that too. Then one that said less. Then one that said more. By midnight, I had drafted 12 versions, each one orbiting the same humiliating wish: to preserve the possibility of being chosen without sounding like I was asking to be chosen. That was the night I truly saw myself. Not in a flattering light, not as the generous woman I had been trying to be, not as the mature partner making room for complexity. I saw a woman sitting on the floor beside her bed because the weight in her chest had become too heavy to carry upright, staring at a phone as if it were an altar, arranging her own pain into acceptable language for a man who had asked her to live in suspension. The room was dim except for the bedside lamp. My knees were drawn up. The duvet hung slightly crooked where I had sat down too quickly, and in that painfully ordinary scene, clarity finally arrived without elegance. He wanted tenderness without responsibility. He wanted connection without choice. And I had been treating his indecision like a sacred process instead of a private convenience. The realization did not make me feel strong. It made me feel exposed. I thought of all the invisible ways I had adapted to him in the months before the break, long before I called them adaptations. How quickly I softened any request for clarity if I sensed him pulling inward. How often I volunteered understanding before he had to ask for it. How many times I translated his vagueness into depth, his retreat into overwhelm, his inconsistency into the difficulty of being a complicated man in a complicated season. I had been telling a story in which his uncertainty was evidence of sincerity, because certainty, from a man like him, might have felt almost too easy to trust. There are women who were not raised to chase the vanishing. I envy them. I was raised, without anyone meaning harm exactly, inside the weather of conditional staying. Love in my childhood had warmth in it, yes, but it was a warmth vulnerable to disappearance. A room could go cold because someone else was tired. Tenderness could recede because another person was overwhelmed. I learned very young to read tone before content, to anticipate withdrawal before it arrived, to lower the volume of my own needs so connection would not flee. It did not feel like training then. It felt like intelligence, perception, goodness. By the time I loved Jack, those instincts had become almost indistinguishable from loyalty. So when he stepped back, I stepped forward into my oldest role, the one who waits beautifully, the one who makes herself emotionally low maintenance, the one who believes that if she is understanding enough, calm enough, loving enough, the person wavering at the edge of intimacy will choose to stay. But what if staying is not the lesson? What if the lesson is seeing how much of yourself you have placed at the feet of someone else's uncertainty? I did not answer him that night. For the first time since the break began, I let silence exist without using it to prove anything. Not strategy, not punishment, not poise, just silence. A small boundary between his confusion and my nervous system. The next morning the apartment looked harsher, or perhaps simply more honest. Dawn had a gray, unadorned quality that made every object seem exact. I rose early, not from rest but from a refusal to remain in bed rehearsing pain. I stripped the sheets. Not because they smelled like him, they barely did by then, but because the bed itself had become a place of waiting. I opened all the windows despite the cold. I put his toothbrush in the drawer. I folded the sweater he had left and placed it in a bag on the top shelf of the hallway cupboard, where I would not have to see it each day, and call that restraint love. Then I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the familiar arrangement of my own life, and understood that reclaiming myself would not feel cinematic. It would feel administrative, concrete, unglamorous. It would begin in behavior long before emotion caught up. So I began there. I took my phone off sound. I stopped checking whether he was online. I answered a delayed client message with full attention instead of split consciousness. I confirmed a train reservation for a weekend I had postponed because I had imagined, without admitting it, that he might by then know what he wanted and return to me. The destination hardly mattered. What mattered was the act of putting my body back into a future that did not depend on his clarity. At work, I let myself notice rooms again, not symbolically. Actually, the angle of light on a dining table, the fatigue in a hallway that needed warmth, the way a dark throw could settle a pale sofa into seriousness. My profession had always been, in some secret way, about emotional suggestion, making spaces feel inhabited before they were, offering coherence where vacancy might otherwise echo. For weeks, I had been using all of that perception against myself, staging hope in every silence. Now I tried, gently, to reverse the skill. I asked what in my own life had been left cold. What needed rearranging not to impress or prepare for anyone, but to let me recognize myself again. Grief did not like this. Grief prefers obsession. It prefers recurrence. It prefers the narcotic rhythm of checking, waiting, imagining. The first days of choosing myself back were not peaceful. They were raw with withdrawal. Every time I resisted the urge to read his message again, I felt the ache of a habit being denied. Every time I did not reach toward the fantasy of his eventual certainty, I had to stand inside the plainness of loss. This is why many women remain in ambiguity longer than they understand. Fantasy is easier to inhabit than reality when reality has not chosen you. But fantasy has a cost. It rents your life and calls it devotion. 3 days after his message, I wrote back. The sentence arrived only after many false starts and no ornament. By then, I knew that anything softened too much would turn back into negotiation. I sat at my kitchen table in the late afternoon light, the same table where he had asked for the break, and typed the words slowly enough to feel each one. I can understand uncertainty, but I can't live inside it. I won't keep waiting to be chosen. I read it once. Then I sent it before tenderness could revise me. The soundlessness afterward was immense. Not relief exactly, more like the collapse of a structure I had been holding upright with my own body. For a few minutes I felt almost ill, as if I had stepped off something moving. Then came panic, because self-respect does not immediately soothe the part of you that still longs to be pursued. I wanted him to answer at once. I wanted him to be stunned by clarity, to recognize what he was losing, to return with the certainty I had finally demanded not in words but in consequence. He did not. His reply, when it came the next day, was brief and sorrowful and still not enough. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. He said I deserved clarity. He said he never wanted to make me feel otherwise. I stared at that last sentence for a long time. Never wanted. As if harm required intention in order to count. As if the absence of cruelty erased the presence of damage. There are men who do not set out to diminish a woman, and yet accept, for far too long, the comfort that her diminishment provides. They do not lie dramatically. They do not betray in ways the world knows how to condemn. They simply allow ambiguity to keep serving them while telling themselves they are being honest because they have named their confusion. Jack was not a monster. In some ways, that was what made it harder. If he had been obviously unkind, my leaving would have felt cleaner. But he had been attentive in real moments, warm in real ways. He had seen me, I think, though not enough to choose me fully. And because he was not monstrous, I had spent months excusing the fact that he was still, all the same, costly to love. The days after my message moved strangely. Time, once colonized by waiting, did not instantly return to its old proportions. It stretched and sagged in places. Mornings were easier than evenings. Work helped because work required surfaces, light, proportion, choices. There is mercy in tasks that ask something visible of your hands. I threw myself into a project involving a narrow apartment with poor natural light and stubborn flooring. And for 3 hours one afternoon, I thought not about him, but about the temperature of lamp shades and the placement of mirrors. It felt almost illicit, that forgetting. Then grief returned at dusk with its old appetite, and I understood that healing would not be a straight release but a series of departures, some temporary, some final, all of them intimate. I began changing my apartment in small ways. Not a complete transformation. I no longer believed in rebirth through furniture. But I moved the chair he had always favored away from the window and put a reading lamp there instead. I bought new sheets in a color I had always loved and once dismissed as too somber for shared space. I brought home branches instead of flowers because flowers felt too eager, too decorative, and branches had a harder beauty that suited the season. I stacked books on the coffee table that had nothing to do with him. I let the rooms become less hospitable to the past version of us and more accurate to the woman who remained. One evening I lit a candle and sat in the living room without music, without my phone in my hand, without television filling the silence so I would not have to hear my own life. The apartment was quiet in a clean way. Outside, someone rolled a suitcase down the street. A scooter passed. Pipes clicked faintly in the wall. I looked around at the modest elegance of the room. The rug I had chosen years ago, the low shelves, the lamp with its softened brass, the bowl on the sideboard holding nothing at all. And for the first time since the break, I felt not abandoned inside my own home but present in it. That presence was fragile. Still, it was mine. Grief changed shape after that. It did not vanish. It became less theatrical and more truthful. I missed him, but not only him. I missed the future I had assembled around the idea of him. I missed the version of myself that felt briefly relieved of guessing. I missed the illusion that patience could secure love. I missed the fantasy that being finally chosen after uncertainty would heal older wounds than this relationship alone had opened. But longing is not always an instruction to return. Sometimes it is only proof that you were attached. I had to learn, slowly, that missing a man does not mean he belongs in your life. Missing can simply be the ache that follows removal, the body recalibrating after dependence, the heart reaching for the shape it had formed around. There is dignity in naming that without building a shrine to it. Weeks passed. The city moved further into winter. Trees grew barer. The air sharpened. Shop windows changed their displays. My work remained full enough to keep me inhabited. I staged a bright family apartment with impossible children's rooms no child would actually keep tidy. I spent a day trying to warm the proportions of a sleek bachelor flat that looked expensive and unlived in equal measure. I traveled by train for the weekend I had postponed and stayed in a small hotel by the sea where the off-season quiet made everything feel stripped to essentials. I walked along the water in a coat buttoned too high against the wind and watched the horizon hold its line without effort. No revelation arrived there. No dramatic purge. Just the profound, nearly forgotten sensation of moving through a day that belonged entirely to me. At dinner I sat alone with a glass of wine and a book I barely read. Around me, couples spoke in low tones, waiters crossed between tables, cutlery clicked against plates. I should have felt conspicuous. Instead, I felt something close to steadiness. Not happiness exactly, but self-possession. The kind that does not depend on being witnessed favorably. The kind that comes when you stop arranging yourself around absence. When I returned home, I slept one full night for the first time in months. That may sound like a small triumph. It was not small. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from living in emotional suspension, from having your nervous system tethered to another person's possible arrival. To sleep without listening for a message, without bargaining in dreams, without waking to rehearse old tenderness against present emptiness, that is no minor relief. It is the body receiving a truth the mind has finally stopped arguing with. Now and then he crossed my mind with fresh pain. Sometimes a place, sometimes a scent, sometimes a sentence I wished I could tell him before remembering that the wishing itself belonged to a former arrangement. Once, while passing a bookstore, I saw a volume he had said I would love and had to stand very still before going inside. Loss is full of these small ambushes. They do not mean you are failing. They mean your life was once intertwined with another life and is now unlearning the path. He did not return in any meaningful way. There were no late redemptive declarations, no grand recognition, no heroic correction of his own ambiguity. And though some younger part of me had once believed such gestures were necessary for closure, I began to understand how much of that belief was simply another form of waiting. Closure was never going to be an answer delivered by the person who benefited from my uncertainty. It had to be the moment I stopped making his confusion the center of my story. That is the quiet violence of waiting for someone to decide your worth. Even after they have stepped back, they continue to occupy the most important room in your inner life. You keep consulting their absence as if it were authority. You keep treating their inability to choose as meaningful commentary on what you deserve. But uncertainty is not insight. A man's hesitation is not a sacred text. And being left in maybe is not a nuanced romance. It is still a wound. I would like to say that once I saw all this, I never slipped again into old habits of overunderstanding, of making excuses for partial availability, of confusing emotional complexity with depth. That would make a better ending. But real endings are less pure than that. I am still a woman shaped by old weather. I still know how quickly tenderness can make me generous beyond wisdom. I still feel the pull, now and then, to interpret instead of receive plainly. Healing did not turn me into someone untouched by my history. It simply made me less willing to abandon myself inside it. That was the true change. Not that I stopped loving unwisely overnight, but that I began to recognize the cost sooner. Months later, a client thanked me for making her empty apartment feel like a place someone could begin again. I smiled, accepted the compliment, and carried a box of unused accessories down the stairwell with both hands. Outside, late light had turned the windows opposite gold. The city seemed full of thresholds. People heading somewhere. People returning. People deciding ordinary things with more confidence than I had once brought to my own heart. I stood on the pavement for a moment longer than necessary and felt, very distinctly, that my life was no longer waiting at the edge of his answer. It had resumed without permission. There is grief in that knowledge, because resuming means admitting what did not happen. He did not come back sure. The love did not ripen under distance into the kind of clarity I thought patience might earn. The story did not reward my restraint with reciprocity. But there was freedom in it too, the kind freedom often arrives in women's lives, not as ecstasy, but as an end to negotiation with what hurts. I had spent so long imagining that the central question was whether he would stay. Would he choose me? Would he return? Would he gather his scattered feelings into something strong enough to build a future on? For months those questions had seemed profound because they kept my longing occupied. But they were never the deepest questions. The deepest questions were quieter and far more dangerous. Why had I treated his indecision as a place to live? Why had I offered my steadiness to someone, using uncertainty as shelter? Why had I believed being chosen, after humiliation would prove I had been worthy all along? The answers were not flattering. They had roots in old wounds, old training, old hunger. But answers do not have to flatter in order to free. Sometimes the most healing thing a woman can do is stop telling a beautiful story about the thing that is costing her life. So this is what I know now. Love that asks you to remain indefinitely available to ambiguity is not asking for patience. It is asking for self-abandonment. Tenderness without clarity can still destabilize you. Longing can feel holy and still lead you away from yourself. And sometimes the cleanest act of love in a ruined room is not waiting to be chosen there. It is standing up, opening the window, letting the air change, and choosing to remain in your own life. There was no single morning when I woke transformed. But there came a morning, months after he asked for the break, when I made coffee and did not think first of whether my phone had lit in the night. There came an afternoon when I booked a future trip without leaving room in it for a possible return. There came an evening when I sat in my living room, looked at the softened geometry of the space, and realized I no longer felt suspended in it. The grief was still present, but it no longer carried the same authority. It had become part of my interior weather, not the whole climate. That is perhaps the most honest kind of healing. Not forgetting, not triumph, not becoming untouched, but becoming inhabited again. Inhabited by your own choices, your own rhythms, your own unborrowed future. If I tell this story now, it is not because the wound is glamorous. It is because I know how many women have been left not by absence but by postponement. Not by doors slammed, but by words spoken softly enough to make the damage difficult to defend. I know how dignified waiting can look from the outside. I know how private the humiliation is. I know how easy it is to believe that if you're just loving enough, calm enough, understanding enough, uncertainty will settle into devotion. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes uncertainty is the answer. And painful as that answer is, it can also be the beginning of a different life. The one in which you stop treating your own heart like a holding area for someone else's fear. I did love him. That remains true. But I loved the woman who finally stopped waiting more. I had spent months asking whether he would stay. At last, I asked the better question, why had I? If something in this story felt familiar, if it touched a place you don't often put into words, I'd love to hear what stayed with you. You can share it in the comments, quietly, in your own way. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sit with you and gently help you return to yourself, you can subscribe and stay close.